text. If you want to turn in your Bibles again then to Mark chapter 10. Let me pop that down. We're thinking very much, of course, in this reading of divorce. Jesus speaking, he was asked about divorce and he spoke about it. The UK recently passed something called the Divorce Bill. I don't know if you saw that in the news. It's been passed in Parliament. It will come into legislation next year, and it's going to make it easier for couples to divorce without having to go through the process of apportioning blame and different things. The government website quotes the Justice Secretary saying this: "The institution of marriage will always be upheld, but when divorce cannot be avoided, the law should not exacerbate conflict and harm a child's upbringing." Yeah, so marriage is good. That's still enshrined in law. But if it breaks down, we want to protect the vulnerable. So there's an idea of having the ideal, but putting concessions in place for when things just go wrong because people are imperfect. And that's something that is reflected. Something of that is reflected in what Jesus says here and in Deuteronomy 24. But Jesus goes much, much further. And in fact, his language turns out to be really quite shocking in a way that we don't quite pick up today. It's massively countercultural sexual ethics. And when you follow it through to its logical conclusion here in the 21st century, it is still shocking and offensive and countercultural to many, many people. But when you remember that that's in the context of cutting off your hand if it causes you to sin, cut off your foot if it causes you to sin, gouge out your eye if it causes you to sin, and we're thinking of what it costs to follow Jesus, well then it's no surprise that this is going to be shocking, countercultural, difficult. Firstly then, Jesus' shocking teaching on divorce. And we'll to begin with, we'll look at this passage in exactly what's going on and what it says. So, first couple of verses, Jesus left Capernaum, went down to the region of Judea and into the area east of the Jordan River. Once again, crowds gathered round him, and as usual, he was teaching them. Some Pharisees came and tried to trap him with this question: should a man be allowed to divorce his wife? So Jesus is travelling south, remember, he's on his way to Jerusalem towards his death at the cross. And along the way, the disciples were learning what it costs to follow him. We are learning what it costs to follow him. As we follow him to the cross, follow him ultimately to glory. And over, what we're seeing is that to follow Jesus is to deny yourself, your whole self, your whole person. Not just, treats occasionally, but you deny who you are to follow him. You completely submit to him. So you're going to serve others. You're going to put yourself last, and it's incredibly challenging and difficult. And as he's going along teaching, and some Pharisees now are testing him with this question about divorce. And divorce was absolutely common in those days. And almost always, it's the man who divorced his wife, the man who sent his wife away. And there were endless arguments about the grounds for divorce. Divorce is obviously okay. But on what grounds? That was the conversation. Certainly, adultery, most people considered. Her displeasing him in some way. He would send her away because maybe she was barren, couldn't have children. Or maybe she was a bad cook. There are actually examples of that. Incredible. And remember that they're actually in Judea. So Jesus is now with his disciples in Judea, and this is John the Baptist's country, where he spoke out against Herod, who had taken his brother's wife because she had actually divorced herself from her husband, as radical as it could be in those days. So when they're asking him about divorce, it's a loaded question. So, verse 3, Jesus answered them with a question. What did Moses say in the law about divorce? Well, he permitted it, they replied. He said a man can give his wife a written notice of divorce and send her away. Absolutely true. Deuteronomy 24 verses 1 to 4 is the only legislation in the Old Testament on divorce. A few prophets talk about it, but in terms of absolute legislation, 4 verses at the start of Deuteronomy 24. And what you read there is that if a woman displeases her husband in a way that's not defined, and that's the sort of big talking point in Jesus' day, what does displease mean? But if a woman displeases her husband and he sends her away, he must give her a written notice of divorce. And she's then free to marry. If she's got this certificate in hand, she's free then to remarry, that the husband sent her away. If that second marriage ends up in some way, the husband dies or he gives her a certificate of divorce, she can't go back to the first husband. That's it. That's what the legislation says. There's a whole host of things left unsaid, and that's the challenge. So the first thing to notice is the law doesn't actually approve of divorce. It doesn't say that divorce is okay. It just recognises that it's going to happen and legislates for it. Much like the divorce bill in the UK. Marriage is good, but if things go wrong, then that's what Deuteronomy 24 is doing. The law actually prohibits the woman from going back to the first husband, which limits easy relationships, promiscuity, that kind of thing. But the most important element, really, is that the woman herself is protected by law. Deuteronomy over and over and over protects the vulnerable in law. So if she went with another man and somebody accused her of adultery, she's got a certificate in her hand that says, no, he sent me away. He divorced me, and I'm now free to remarry this other man. So, because legally she would have no rights if she didn't have this certificate. So this divorce law protects the vulnerable. That's what it's about. So they're asking Jesus about divorce, and he reminds the Pharisees that, so what did Moses say? He asks them. And they give this answer, and then he reminds them that that's not all that Moses had to say about marriage, because Genesis comes before Deuteronomy. So verses 5 to 9. Jesus responded, he wrote this commandment only as a concession to your hard hearts. But God made them male and female from the beginning of creation. This explains why a man leaves his father and mother and is joined to his wife, and the two are united into one. Since they are no longer two but one, let no one split apart what God has joined together. Now, we can't quite grasp really how shocking that is to everybody who heard it, because obviously divorce is okay. The Pharisees and society generally accepted that divorce is okay, and what we're arguing about is on what are the grounds for divorce and how do we look after people and that kind of thing. And Jesus says, no, listen, divorce is wrong. And they're in shock. It's the most amazing new sexual ethic teaching they've ever had, and Jesus says, no, it's there in the beginning. That's how things are supposed to be. If you're going to think about divorce and remarriage and stuff, think about how it's supposed to be. Even his disciples are shocked. So verse 10, later when he was alone with his disciples in the house, they brought up the subject again. They're like, Jesus, what are you talking about? Obviously divorce is okay. Can you explain what you've got to say about this? Because it's so new. He's completely challenging what is normal in society's sexual ethics. All in the context of what does it cost to follow Jesus. So verse 11, he told them, whoever divorces his wife and marries someone else commits adultery against her. And if a woman divorces her husband and marries someone else, she commits adultery. They're shocked. The Spice Girls. Not often you're going to quote the Spice Girls in a sermon, is it? The Spice Girls had a song a few years ago called Two Become One. And it's a romantic song and all that. But it has this idea of that a man and a woman coming together, sexually coming together, and becoming one. It's an entirely biblical concept. That we describe people as a couple, who are a couple, as an item, don't we? The two do become one. When a man and a woman come together in marriage and in sex, the two become one flesh. You're one. It's the way we were meant to be. Of course, it's not required for everybody to marry. Jesus himself obviously didn't marry. But when a man and a woman come together in a relationship, they become one. That's how it was supposed to be. So sex and marriage go hand in hand. There's a moral and a spiritual dimension to marriage and to sex. Two people become one before God. Divorce then rejects that oneness. It splits it, it breaks it. That which has been joined before God, divorce separates. And adultery is even worse, because it smashes that and actually joins with someone else. It creates a new oneness with someone else. And in that situation, Jesus, quite clear in Matthew's Gospel, the innocent party who's had this relationship smashed apart, the innocent party is then actually free to remarry. Free of all guilt, no problem at all. Okay, well, if Jesus says, look, divorce is bad, why is that law there in Deuteronomy? Well, he explains, because people have hard hearts. It's a concession. There was a law that says that money raised from prostitution wasn't to be given into the temple tax. Okay, does that mean that prostitution's okay, just that you can't use the money in that way? No, absolutely not. It's a recognition that goes on, but there's a line. You can't use that money for this kind of thing. So some of the laws are a concession, knowing that people will sin. But the ideal is marriage is for life. In a relationship, if you're unwilling to forgive, if you're unwilling to change, if you're unwilling to love, then your hard heart is dooming that relationship. So Deuteronomy 24 is a concession to hard hearts, people who will not forgive, will not love, will not change, and actually doom their relationships to failure. And when that happens, well, we need to make sure that there's protection for the vulnerable. The woman in society was the one who was most vulnerable in that situation, so that there's a legislation for her. But to follow Jesus then, to be in the kingdom of God, demands the highest moral ethics, and this is what Jesus is pointing out. Now, we can come to Jesus with our messed up lives and all sorts of history and baggage. Often you can say, well, you wouldn't start here. But Jesus says, look, this is the ideal, and you need to work through how we're going to uphold those ideals. And if you have a clean slate, well, don't mess up in the first place. And concessions are there for the sinful and the hard-hearted. To follow Jesus, you have to deny yourself. Deny your very self. So, what do we get from this? We get a model for sexual ethics. Now, a few years ago, the UK legalised same-sex marriage. And Christians are divided on the issue. Whole churches, the Church of England in itself is divided on the issue. And some churches conduct same-sex ceremonies and others won't. And one of the comments that was coming up at the time as that legislation was going through was that Jesus said, look, love your neighbour. Love is love, right? So love your neighbour. And Jesus never said anything about same-sex relationships. You can go through Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, and where Jesus is quoted elsewhere, and there's nothing from Jesus' lips on same-sex relationships. All he said was love your neighbour, and that marriage is good, which is obviously true. Jesus actually never spoke explicitly about a number of sexual ethical topics. But in what he's doing here in divorce is he's going back to basics. He's given us a model to address any sexual ethic topic that comes up. The starting point for Jesus isn't the points of detail about this and that. So they were asking her about divorce is obviously okay, but under what circumstances can we do? No, Jesus says, no, it's not okay. When we come to Jesus with a sexual ethic topic, how we are to live, we go back to the beginning. The starting point is to look at how God created us. What is the model of how things should be? That's the goal. That's the model standard. And that is kingdom life. That's kingdom living. That's how you're to live to please your Creator in the world he has created and given you. Obviously, not everybody wants to please God. I mean, most people have no interest in that. We're in a very mixed world, and people have hard hearts. Hard hearts that break relationships, refusing to love and change and forgive. There are many warm-hearted people who actually have no time for God, but genuinely form loving relationships, intimate relationships. Some of those relationships don't conform to the biblical model. So the question is, what are we to do as Christians? Well, we can start by noting that even the Word of God, Deuteronomy there 24, did include concessions, recognizing that people lived in other ways. Without actually approving of those other ways, there were concessions on how to conduct yourself. And the law that was put in place was primarily there to protect the vulnerable. Whoever was vulnerable in that culture at that time, which at that time was the woman. Now, as Christians, we want to conform to the sexual ethics that Jesus gives. We want to live in that kingdom. We don't expect the world to conform to that. They're not going to bend the knee to Jesus. They don't care about following him. So how do we work with people? So it's worth saying again, we don't expect others to conform. And those of us who wish to follow Jesus, well, we have to inevitably seek to live a life that is pleasing to him. So to follow Jesus may well mean change. But when somebody isn't going to follow him, we don't expect change. So faced with a question or a situation about relationships or sexual ethics, we can ask some questions based on what Jesus has done here. There's a clear model. So what's the biblical model of how things should be? Would be our first question, and he takes us back there to creation itself. How do we love our neighbour then, who doesn't follow Jesus? People who disagree with that view. How can I love someone who disagrees with that view? That's really important. How do we protect the vulnerable in that situation, if there is anybody vulnerable in a situation like that? And what does it mean for me to follow Jesus if I'm affected by some of these sexual ethics? Do I need to change? And a sort of follow-up question might be, what do we do when Christians disagree? That's another challenge again. So let's think through some of our modern challenges in terms of sexual ethics. And we want to love our neighbour. Love your neighbour. How we can apply this thinking then, this model that Jesus has done to various situations. And you begin with something that's probably the most controversial place to start, which is trans ideology, trans people. It's the idea that your biological sex is determined at birth, but your actual gender needn't be the same. You are who you identify yourself to be, whether it's male or female, or both, or neither, or fluid. You decide for yourself your gender, which is separate from your biological sex, determined at birth. So a man might feel he wants to be identified as a woman, and then to have others use female pronouns, she and her, and to address her using her chosen feminine name. And increasingly, you'd be described as committing a hate crime if you refuse to use her chosen name or her female pronouns. Now, you might actually ridicule somebody like that. You might think, that's just ridiculous, it's stupid. In saying that, you're as alien to them as they are to you, frankly. And to them, their whole identity is bound up with matters of sexuality and gender. At profound level for them, it's who they are. Following often years of self-examination and challenge and discovery, they feel that this is who they are. So to say, well, that's stupid, is deeply offensive and hurtful. So how does Jesus' model help us as Christians? Well, for starters, it's clear that there we go. The creation account flatly contradicts trans thinking. So Jesus takes you back and says, look, we were created male and female. That's it. That's who you are. Some people are biologically mixed. In terms of LGBTQ, there's an I, and that recognizing that there are people who are physically, biologically mixed, and incredibly hard to deal with, emotionally and physically, and all sorts of challenges. It's a very small number, but there are people like that. But what we're dealing with here is the majority situation where biology isn't in doubt, but someone feels that their gender doesn't line up with their biology. How do we love someone? As Christians, we can ridicule, but that's not loving, is it? It's certainly inaccurate to say that you hate them if you use the wrong terms. That's a ridiculous thing to say. This term hate crime is just so overused. But the question is, are you really loving them if you refuse to recognize who they determine themselves to be at a core level in terms of their identity, their person? How can you say that you love them when you won't even use the name that they've given themselves? We certainly want to be clear about our position. I follow Jesus and the standards that he has apportioned. You don't. I still love you. I will still use your name and pronoun that you asked me to. I love you. I think there's a better way, and his name is Jesus. But following him comes at a cost. That's very much what these verses are about. And for many people, this is a massive cost. We need to think about how we protect the vulnerable. Well, there are very vulnerable people in this situation. It's actually children. There are children who come through with these kind of questions before puberty are given puberty blockers. And it's fair to say that there are medical experts who try to raise the issue that this is dangerous, this is harmful. Those medical experts get their work revoked or unsupported. These things are harmful, and you can go on Twitter and you can look at people who have taken these drugs and find that their bone density isn't as it's supposed to be, that they're barren and can't have children, and there are an enormous number of complications. So who are the vulnerable in this situation? It's children, and Christians need to be more vocal about how people can have those ideologies, but they don't have the right to harm children. So it's that Deuteronomy 24 idea of legislation that is protecting the vulnerable, even though we're not going to prevent people from doing things that are contrary to God's standard. Well, what if a trans person became a Christian? What would we expect? Well, Jesus has been teaching the need to deny yourself. What a cost that would be, how hard that would be. We don't underestimate the profound challenge that would cause. It's a hugely costly thing to do. But as a Christian, it's a liberation that Christ himself becomes your identity. He is your identity. You follow him, and only him. You deny yourself. You follow him. You live to please him. It's a challenge. It's really difficult. What about same-sex relationships? Well, again, what's the model? Jesus said, a man and a woman. That's flatly against our model, our current worldview. How do you love your neighbour then who disagrees with what Jesus has said? Well, the same as you love anybody else. It isn't a, yes, Jesus describes this as a sin, but it's not a special sin. It's not different from anything else. And we love everybody else. You love them for who they are without ever participating in the sins that they have in their lives. You do that with everybody. You might choose not to go to a same-sex wedding because when you go to a wedding, you're actually a participant in blessing that event. You might choose not to go to that. But you wouldn't stop you loving those people, visiting. If it's family, they're still family. What does it mean then for somebody in a same-sex relationship to follow Jesus? Well, Jesus sets the standard, doesn't he? For all of us. If your eye causes you to sin, gouge it out. If your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. If your foot causes you to sin, cut it off. There has to be transformation. There has to be change when we follow Jesus. That doesn't mean that somebody stops being gay or lesbian. It doesn't necessarily change their attraction. In which case, it does mean celibacy. Or what if there are children? It's a real situation where there's a same-sex couple with children and one of those adults becomes a Christian. What do? Which is better, to have a broken home or for them somehow to be living together? What happens? Real wisdom and care and love has to be applied to those things. I know of a real example. I think they stayed together because for the children it was better actually to be a family, though they adopted separate bedrooms and became celibate. It's hard. It's not where you'd start. But knowing the model, how can we move towards that? What about sex before marriage? What's the biblical model? The biblical model is that sex and marriage go hand in hand. A man and a woman become one flesh. At Contagious a few years ago, we do a Q&A session with these teenagers at Contagious, and a few years ago, one question came through. It was from a lad, and he wanted to know, how intimate can I be with my girlfriend? Yeah, I want to uphold the biblical ethics, but, kiss and a cuddle, how intimate can I be? And the leader's reply said, look, let me reword the question for you. What you want to know is, how close to sin can I get before it's sin? At which everybody in the room sort of went, ouch, yes, that is what's being asked. In Ephesians, Paul says marriage between a man and a woman is a picture of the love that Christ has for his bride, the church. Christ died so that she would become pure and blameless, spotless and holy. And whether you're married or unmarried, that's how we're to hold marriage in our minds. That's the model. So in that example, the fellow who was answering the question went on to say, look, if you really love her, you will want her to be pure and blameless and spotless, just as Christ loved his church. That's your goal for her. So keep your hands off. Sex and marriage go together. Now, all of that stuff, it's a biblical Christian view the world just doesn't share. Sex and marriage don't automatically go together for most people. Ever since the sexual revolution. But you and I love our neighbour by showing them that there's a better way, whether you're married or single. Both celibacy and sex and marriage actually point to the relationship between Christ and his people. So you love each other by using Christ's relationship with his church as the model for your relationship, whether you're married or single. So what you see in what we're looking at here is that Jesus' model for addressing questions of sexual ethics can be applied to other situations too. And polyamorous relationships where not just two people are married, but 3, 4, 5, however many people are actually all married. Jesus said, no, a man and a woman. So we can apply the same thinking, even paedophilia. A man, a woman. There are many Christians, of course, who come to different conclusions from what I've given here. And typically their thinking would be driven by culture, by reinterpreting the Bible. Jesus says, go back to the basics, go back to the Bible. Whereas other people would say, yeah, but if we start with culture and where we are, and then we kind of read the Bible in the light of the culture, it's the wrong way around. It's just the wrong way around. Decide for yourself who's right. But Jesus took you back to that original model. Whatever your situation, whatever your response, you're being challenged in Mark's Gospel by a single thought. What does it cost to follow Jesus? And for lots of people, the cost of following is just too high. If you choose to follow him, you must forsake all sin. Repent of it. Ask his forgiveness. When Jesus demands that you repent of something that you consider a core part of your identity, it's hugely unnerving. It's terrifying. It's objectionable. It's offensive. Never underestimate the challenge that is. But always, the invitation from Jesus stands. And it's this, in chapter 8, verse 34. Let me find it. Calling the crowd to join his disciples, Jesus said this, if any of you wants to be my follower, you must turn from your selfish ways, take up your cross and follow me. If you try to hang on to your life, you will lose it. But if you give up your life for my sake and for the sake of the good news, you will save it. And what do you benefit if you gain the whole world but lose your own soul? Is anything worth more than your soul? If anyone is ashamed of me and my message in these adulterous and sinful days, the Son of Man will be ashamed of that person when he returns in the glory of his Father with the holy angels. It's costly to follow Jesus. We're going to sing, or you're going to sing, our final hymn.